Welcome to Football Conspiracies.
I'm Jared Cole.
And I'm Jared Rabinovich.
This week's episode, Super Bowl XXXVII. All right, Jared, so this is just a little thing I wanted to add to the beginning of this episode because we talked about it a couple episodes ago. Remember when we were talking about international NFL and how we said that we wanted to see an NFL game in Antarctica?
Yeah, I do.
Well, there's a high school in Alaska that plays on a football field that is right next to the Arctic Ocean.
Okay, so that's not Antarctica, but that's pretty damn close.
But it is so far north that they have to play during the summer months instead of during the winter months because there isn't enough light.
That is crazy.
Yeah, I can't even begin to pronounce what the city is, but
as with most cities in Alaska.
Exactly,
yeah.
But it's up there.
It is, and it's literally on the beach. Wow.
Yeah.
That, honestly, I would pay a lot of money to go see a game in that stadium.
Yeah, polar bear might show up, you know.
Oh my, there's actual polar bears. Yeah, that is honestly terrifying.
Yep. So I just thought that was a little thing to be added because we wanted to see it up there and they're getting close.
Exactly. And you know what? This is going to be our best shot of seeing a polar bear on a D-line.
Yeah.
For today's episode, we will be speaking about Super Bowl XXXVII and the plethora of allegations made by players and coaches claiming the match was fixed. Before I bring you all down this rabbit hole with me, I gotta ask, J. Cole, do you happen to know anything about Super Bowl XXXVII?
My Tampa Bay Buccaneers beat the Raiders, I know that. The game was definitely not fixed.
That is a non-partial take.
No, this is very non-biased take. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers won their Super Bowl fair and square.
So I think J. Cole's already come to his conclusion on this story before we've even begun it. No fix for you.
No fix.
We'll see if anything changes down this hole, because before we get into the allegations itself, this I actually found to be a pretty believable conspiracy as far as a lot of the things that we talk about. I'll definitely give you guys my personal conclusion towards the end of the episode, but as far as I'm concerned, this is a pretty good story. There's a lot of pretty strong evidence here and a lot of big names coming out in support of it.
It's just a story. It's not truth. It's just a story.
Of course. So, before we get into everything, I'm just going to give you guys a quick rundown of the matchup itself. On January 26, 2003, the AFC's Oakland Raiders would find themselves up against the NFC's Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So how do these two teams compare to one another? In terms of regular season records, the Raiders put up an 11-5 record, while the Bucs narrowly bested them with a 12-4 record. For all intents and purposes, these are pretty comparable teams as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, they were both pretty good teams in 2003.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nothing crazy during the regular season, no outstanding performance, but they made their way to the Super Bowl, very credible teams.
Yes.
And no matter how comparable these teams were, the odds makers in Vegas actually gave the edge to the Raiders, giving them a 4-point advantage in the spread. For those who are not familiar with how sports betting works, this was seen to be a very close matchup, with neither team being seen as a massive underdog or favorite.
Yeah, 4 points isn't something to blink at, though. That's pretty...
Yes, I did look at previous spreads that they had during, Super Bowl history, and this one was pretty average. It wasn't too high, too low, but it was definitely on the lower side of spreads that I saw. That being said, a lot of Super Bowls, especially in recent years, are pretty much dead even heats.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, even closer than the 4-point spread that we saw in 2003. Putting all this aside, the most talked about storyline in the weeks leading up to the championship game actually had to do with the team's two head coaches, the Raiders' Bill Callahan and the Buccaneers' John Gruden. As a matter of fact, this storyline was so prominent that fans and news outlets actually began referring to the game as the Gruden Bowl, colloquially. Others would actually refer to it as the Pirate Bowl, as an allusion to the fact that both teams have pirates as their mascots. I bring this up not because it matters to the story, but because I think it's a cute little detail.
Yeah, I like Pirate Bowl.
Exactly. That's a cute little name.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and that was definitely something that some people refer to it as, but the Gruden Bowl actually had a little bit of popularity behind it.
Well, I mean, they are playing in the Super Bowl. So, I mean, it already has a name.
Yes, that's a fair take. But there is a reason behind why people start calling this the Gruden Bowl. And to explain this, we have to go back in time a little. From 1998 to 2001, John Gruden was the head coach of the Oakland Raiders, actually. So before the 2002 season, the same year as Super Bowl XXXVII, Gruden would become the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as a result of a trade. So in his first season as the Bucs head coach, Gruden managed to bring his team to their first ever Super Bowl appearance. And to make it all the more dramatic, that Super Bowl would be played against the team he was the head coach of only 1 year earlier.
Yeah, it's a good storyline, and
yeah, it's very reminiscent of like the Matt Stafford Jared Goff matchup that we see when we see the Rams and the Lions play. You know, it's just a fun little storyline of people who, you know, traded teams or whatever it is.
It's a return to home sort of game where like you see where you once played, and
exactly. I think it's a pretty compelling storyline as far as Super Bowls go. To be honest.
Yeah, for sure.
So with Gruden off the Bucs, the Raiders called upon the aforementioned Bill Callahan to replace him as the team's new head coach. Callahan at the time was the team's offensive coordinator, under Gruden himself, obviously, and reportedly the two were very close friends. The game itself was an unmitigated disaster for the Oakland Raiders. Coming into the game as 4-point favorites in the spread, they would go on to lose the championship title with a score of 48-21 for the Bucs.
Let's fucking go.
Yeah, 3-year-old you would be so proud.
Hey, when I started getting into football and I chose the Buccaneers, I didn't even know that they had won a Super Bowl. So I got lucky with that, but
yeah, exactly. And you got on before the Brady bandwagon.
I was on before Jameis Winston too.
So you were just like cheering for dog shit?
Yes, I started in with dog shit, so
you know,
it made the Super Bowl even that much better.
I'm gonna say, yeah, good for you for sticking it through. So back to the game itself. After getting the first 3 points of the game with a field goal, the Raiders would go on to give up 34 consecutive points. As a result, the score would be 34-3 for the Bucs late into the third quarter. So this would obviously go on to be considered one of the most lopsided Super Bowls in modern history. Obviously, we've seen some worse things recently, but in terms of Super Bowls historical, 34-3 in the third quarter, it's over.
That's up there. Yeah,
that must have not been a fun viewer experience. So now that we have a general background of what happened at Super Bowl XXXVII, it's time to get into the conspiracy. Before I get any deeper into it, J. Cole, I gotta know if you have any suspicions surrounding why this game has been called out for being rigged.
No, I have no clue.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's not super obvious. It's not on the surface. It's not like when you're watching the game, you could have seen any bad play calls, similar to how a lot of the spectators felt after Super Bowl III. And to make this actually a little bit more interesting, it's not even the fans who are making such an uproar about this. So I want to preface all of this with saying that this is far and away one of the most believable claims I've seen to fix up a Super Bowl, like I mentioned earlier. Seemingly every year, disgruntled fans and occasionally disgruntled players will kick up a storm about how their team's Super Bowl loss was the result of a nefarious plot. That being said, it seems that in the case of Super Bowl XXXVII, there might actually have been a nefarious plot, according to a handful of players, that is. In the weeks leading up to the match, the Raiders concocted a game plan that seemed to satisfy the team members. According to Tim Brown, a receiver for the Raiders at the time,
we get our game plan for victory on Monday, and the game plan says we're going to run the ball. We average 340 pounds on the offensive line. They average 280 on the defensive line. We're all happy with that. Everybody is excited.
So before I actually get any further, I just want to mention that the exact weight advantage I was unable to confirm, but I don't think this is entirely accurate because, like, I don't know, that does not pass the smell test to me. 340-pound average O-line. These guys are not 340 pounds.
That's a big O-line.
Exactly. Like, that does not seem realistic to me. It's totally possible that this was the case because they were actually the number one offense in the league, but that seems a little bit too much of a stretch for me. I just want to point that out before we get any further because that seems like a little bit of historical bullshit.
Yeah, I feel like there's a little bit of an exaggeration, like, oh, we're a little bit bigger and oh, they're a little bit smaller.
Exactly. They certainly were bigger, but that size advantage seems absurd to me. So this seems like, you can disagree with me, but it seems like a pretty sound game plan, right? Especially considering the Raiders would be up against a formidable defense. Their number one offense would actually be against the Bucks' number one defense, the first time that a number one defense and number one offense would face each other in a Super Bowl.
Huh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so this was like a really good matchup.
Yeah, this is top tier.
Yeah, like going into this game, I'd be really excited to watch the Super Bowl. I would think it's going to be a close, good, strategic game, right? And it's shaping up to be that.
Yeah.
Right? You're going to be seeing a lot of running. You're going to be seeing this crazy O-line up against this D-line, and that's going to be the strategy for the Raiders. Take care of their size advantage and run that ball as far as you can.
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
Inch by inch, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
So, even though they had this game plan all mapped out, according to several sources inside the Raiders locker room, on the Friday prior to the game, just 2 days before the Super Bowl, Bill Callahan completely scrapped the original game plan. According to some, including Tim Brown, the Raiders receiver mentioned earlier, who would go on to become one of the most vocal advocates on behalf of this Super Bowl being fixed, the team was shocked, and many were rather upset with the last-minute switch-up. Instead of using a game plan primarily focused on running in order to exploit their size advantage, the Raiders would switch to a plan which utilized far more passing plays. The Raiders would end up rushing the ball only 11 times throughout the entire game. Some accused this new plan not only of taking away their O-line size advantage, but also of negating all the practice they worked on up until that point. Now the players would only have a couple days to completely relearn their Super Bowl game plan, a game plan which would not play to the team's largest strength, their weight.
Yeah, that's big.
Yeah, I mean, like, these guys spend weeks and weeks preparing for every opponent.
I mean, so does the coach.
Of course.
So he must know something the players don't. Sometimes coaches don't say everything. No, players are always coming up with bullshit for reasons why they lose the big game, because they don't want it to be their fault. Like, oh, no, we didn't lose the big game. Like you said at the beginning.
Of course, and that's, like, a lot of what we saw in the Super Bowl III, I think. It was very like, oh, we shouldn't have lost to Joe Namath. Like, that's crazy. We're better than him. The NFL's better. But in this case, there's, like, a lot more evidence than just this.
Yeah, let's see.
Let's move on to the next piece. Another argument proponents of the rigged game theory pointed to were regarding the coaching style and audibles used by Callahan and the Raiders. This part actually seems very realistic to me. Gruden worked with the Raiders organization for years before this and was a large part of the success they had seen over the previous few seasons. Because of his intimate knowledge of the Raiders team, some suspect that he had more foresight into the Raiders' game plan and strategy than any other team would have been able to. After the game, some players on the Raiders' offense actually claimed that the Bucks' defense was able to recognize a lot of their audibles and play calls. Adam True, the Raiders center who played during the Super Bowl, was quoted as saying,
"They knew what was coming. I know a couple of plays in the first half we had audibilized, and they knew what it was. Obviously, Gruden spent time with that defense."
Additionally, Raiders QB Rich Gannon was quoted as saying,
"There's a lot of familiarity with what we do. I mean, their head coach runs the exact same offense, same verbiage, same terminology."
Yeah, I mean, to me at least, this seems like a very realistic argument as to why the Raiders were put at a disadvantage when they came up against their old coach's team in the Super Bowl.
I mean, you could also say that the Bucks had good coaches and they could just figure out what the audibles were.
You could also say that, and you could also say that maybe it was a little bit of incompetency on Callahan's part for not changing the audibles more, knowing that he was up against the team's previous head coach in the Super Bowl.
Yeah, like that's a little much.
Exactly.
Like, you gotta be using your brain a little bit more in that aspect.
Exactly. As much as they're talking about this game plan switch up being so detrimental, I doubt the previous game plan had different audibles attached to it, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. It would have been the same audibles, the same plays, the same, yeah.
Clearly it wasn't that well thought out, which is crazy to me considering like the level of strategy that goes into most NFL locker rooms. So all this taken together is definitely pretty sketchy if you ask me, but it also begs the question, why would Bill Callahan want to sabotage his own team and in turn his own legacy? Here is the case for Callahan's motive, as explained by Tim Brown.
"We all called it sabotage because Callahan and Tampa Bay coach John Gruden were good friends, and Callahan had a big problem with the Raiders, hated the Raiders, only came because Gruden made him come. Literally walked off the field on us a couple of times during the season when he first got here, and first couple of years. So really he had become someone who was part of the staff, but we just didn't pay him any attention. Gruden leaves, he becomes the head coach. It's hard to say that the guy sabotaged the Super Bowl. Can you really say that? That can be my opinion, but I can't say for a fact that that's what his plan was to do, to sabotage the Super Bowl. He hated the Raiders so much that he would sabotage the Super Bowl so his friend can win the Super Bowl. That's hard to say because you can't prove it. And it also just doesn't sound true. Like, I don't understand. Like, why would you put together the number one offense in the NFL and go 11-5 with a team you don't care about? How could you put a full season into the works? It's not like they had this like planned beforehand, like, oh, John, you're going to run the best defense and I'm going to run the best offense and maybe we'll get in the Super Bowl and then I'm going to give you the win.
I completely agree. I think it's like flimsy at best. Like, we should get into Callahan's response because I think he lays it out pretty well. In response, Callahan released a statement saying that he, quote unquote, categorically and unequivocally denied the allegations. He would go on to say that any suggestion that I would undermine the integrity of the sport I love and dedicated my life to, or dishonor the commitment I made to our players, coaches, and fans is flat out wrong. I think it would be in the best interests of all, including the game America loves, that these allegations be retracted immediately. Personally, I find this motive a little flimsy. I think, as you agree with me, it seems very, very far-fetched that someone put this like massive amount of commitment that takes to become an NFL coach and bring their team to the Super Bowl just to throw it all away because they didn't like the team, because they wanted to like pat their buddy on the back.
This is some like Bill Belichick double agent type bullshit.
I agree. But what's crazy about this is Bill Belichick double agent theory was written by some guy on Reddit named DJ Gallo. This is being said by the Raiders wide receiver Tim Brown.
Yeah, no, it's still just as flimsy.
Okay. And just so you know, we are going to be getting into it a little later, but this is not the only person who believes that the reason the loss might have happened was because Callahan didn't like the team. And I think the testimony from the next person you might take a little more seriously.
Okay, fine. Let's hear what we have.
Well, that's going to come a little bit later.
Okay.
So all this being said, there is still one huge aspect of the story I've left out. The story of the Oakland Raiders center, Barrett Robbins. Do you have any idea about the story of Barrett Robbins? Because I didn't know about this at all, and it is, I think, one of the craziest Super Bowl plot lines of all time. It's definitely not like a happy one.
No, but I've never heard of this.
Yeah, this is crazy, and we'll get into it. So about 24 hours before the game on Sunday, Barrett Robbins completely dropped off the grid. He was MIA as of Saturday night. The next day, the day of the Super Bowl, the team was still unable to track him down. Just a few hours before the game was played, Robbins was admitted into San Diego Hospital, where he'd be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. As the media would later report, it was discovered that Robbins would take off to go party in Tijuana, Mexico, the day before the game, because of a manic episode he was going through. He was convinced that the Raiders had already played and won the championship, and he was going to Tijuana to celebrate. With Robbins missing, the Raiders were forced to substitute him for their backup center, Adam True. The Super Bowl was played without Oakland's all-pro center.
It's not really a fold in the conspiracy. It's more just like a sad story.
It would be just a sad story if it wasn't folded into the conspiracy. So let me get there. I think it's rather evident to all of us why losing your team's all-pro center the day before the Super Bowl may play a large role in your team's eventual defeat. Robbins was considered instrumental in directing the Raiders' offense and was widely regarded as the O-line's leader. This incident alone could explain away much of the suspicion surrounding Callahan and his quote-unquote desire to fix the Super Bowl. After all, it's pretty unsurprising that the team that made it to the championship by heavily relying on the league's number one O-line fell short in the Super Bowl after losing the player whose job it was to direct that O-line. All this being said, some Raiders players have implied that they believe the trigger for Robbins' manic episode was Callahan's decision to completely change the game plan the day before his disappearance. To once again quote from Raiders wide receiver Tim Brown.
The facts are what they are. That less than 36 hours before the game, we changed our game plan. And we go into that game absolutely knowing that we have no shot. That the only shot we had if Tampa didn't show up. Barrett Robbins begged Coach Callahan, "Do not do this to me. I don't have time to make my calls, to get my calls ready. You can't do this to me on Friday. We haven't practiced full speed. We can't get this done."
On the topic of if Robbins' manic episode was caused by the change-up of Callahan, Tim Brown continued,
I'm not saying one had anything to do with the other. All I'm saying is that those are the facts of what happened Super Bowl week. So our ire wasn't towards Barrett Robbins, it was towards Bill Callahan. Because we feel as if he wouldn't have did what he did, then Barrett wouldn't have done what he did. Now, should Barrett have manned up and tried to do it? Absolutely. But everyone knew that Barrett was unstable anyway. So to put him in that situation, not that he was putting him in that situation, but for that decision to be made without consulting the players the Friday before the Super Bowl, I played 27 years of football. The coaches never changed the game plan on Friday before the game. I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody here. All I'm saying is that those are the facts of what happened. So people look at Barrett and they say all these things, but every player in that locker room will tell you, you'd better talk to Bill Callahan, because if not for Coach Callahan, I don't think we're in that situation. Callahan has to have something to say to that.
Unfortunately, I have not been able to track down any response from Callahan.
That seems like just as damaging to him. He caused a panic attack that triggered this whole thing.
So the statement that I read earlier that said that Callahan was that all this was unequivocally untrue and that he was denying all allegations, I believe that statement covered this part of it, because he was responding to Tim Brown's interview where he said all of this.
Okay, so he's saying all of everything. Okay.
Yes, yeah, so I believe he did respond to it, not specifically. I don't think he was going to bring more attention to those allegations, which I think was probably the right thing to do.
Yeah. But I mean, also, you're playing in a Super Bowl, sometimes a little last-minute planning needs to happen, and if that's what caused the game plan change and the center couldn't take it, that's not the coach's fault.
No, I would care to agree. It seems weird to blame that being put on to the coach. I think it was just an unfortunate... If his manic episode was triggered by the change in the game plan, as Tim Brown certainly seems to be implying, I don't think that could be pinned on Callahan. I think he realistically was probably doing what he thought was best for his team, and that had an unfortunate effect on Robbins, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That being said, I find it a little... I'm a little skeptical myself that these two things are connected. And actually, let's look at the response that Robbins gave to the interview and the remarks made by Tim Brown. He would go on to say this.
I would be absolutely wrong to tell you that was the case. If Tim Brown goes on record and says that he changed the game plan on Friday, I don't remember. Because you've got to understand, I was going through a manic episode that had lasted more than 2 weeks. At that point in time, when we went to the Super Bowl, I was having to shoot my foot up. I was having acupuncture, going through a lot of pain. It was a lot of stress. Pain is a big trigger when it comes to bipolar. That was something I was going through, as well as self-medicating. I'm not going to say that I remember the exact meeting that took place, but I haven't heard anybody deny it. So Callahan didn't cause the manic episode.
Yeah,
he was already unfortunately going through it.
Yes, my opinion is clear on this, is that I don't think Callahan was triggered this or was trying to trigger any sort of manic episode in Robbins with this change of the game plan. It's so far-fetched to me and seems like a really odd fold in the story. And no matter what other nefarious motivations you may attribute to Callahan, this specifically seems a bridge too far.
Way too far.
And just to cap off this section about Barrett Robbins, I will now be drawing on some ideas I found laid out in the article Bill Callahan's Super Bowl Conspiracy Part 2, written by Dalton Blackman. The first thing Blackman points out is that Robin very well could have run off regardless of the change in the game plan, just like you were saying. Clearly, and according to Robin himself, he had been suffering for weeks before this. He was feeling pain, which he himself says was triggering his bipolar, and that is more likely than the change in the game plan what led to his eventual break. The second point Blackman makes is that Robbins had a documented history of disappearing and reappearing. Just 2 years before, in 2001, Robbins was MIA in the week leading up to the AFC Championship game. However, this incident was not reported at the time because he made it to the game and he actually played in it.
Okay, so it looked like that was going to happen. Something sort of similar is kind of guess what they were hoping for. He's been MIA before, maybe he'll show up when it's game time and we'll be ready to go. But it was actually...
Exactly. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, and I just want to mention that, like, I feel really bad for Robbins in this incident, like, regarding the treatment he received from fans and other media following the Super Bowl. Like this man has been very open about his mental health struggles, and he did not deserve any mistreatment for what happened. And also, I think it's pretty unsavory of Tim Brown to fold this into his conspiracy, because, you know, this is truly, it's about Barrett Robbins and his mental health struggle. I really don't think this is about Callahan and wanting to rig the Super Bowl.
No, not at all. And you also think about it because he says pain is a trigger for bipolar, and the last time it was triggered this badly was at an AFC Championship game. So when you're playing more games in a season and your body's getting more injured throughout the season, making it to the Super Bowl adds one more game, which would add even more pain, which would trigger it even more. That's if anything, playing in that AFC Championship game that year is the trigger then, if you want to talk to Tim Brown about this.
That could definitely be a contributing factor to his eventual disappearance at the Super Bowl. But this is a very prominent part of the theory, no matter how much I don't think this should really fold into the overall idea of this.
Yeah, I don't either.
I think it is a really good explanation for why they lost the Super Bowl in a fair and square way.
Yeah, exactly.
They lost their center.
You lose your center, you're at a great disadvantage.
Exactly. So I think it's a good reason as an explanation, but I don't think it is a good part of this conspiracy. I don't see it fitting in.
No, I don't see a conspiracy, and I don't think this would fold into one.
That's totally fair. I'm personally on the same track as you. So before we get to the end of this tale, I do want to point out, as I alluded to earlier, that Tim Brown was not the only vocal advocate of the rigged game theory. Other teammates came out of the woodworks to support Brown's claims. One notable example is Hall of Fame wide receiver Jerry Rice. Following the Tim Brown interview that I've quoted from several times this episode, Jerry Rice appeared on ESPN's NFL Live, where he said this:
I was very surprised that he waited till the last second, and I think a lot of the players, they were surprised also. So in a way, maybe because he didn't like the Raiders, he decided, hey look, maybe we should sabotage just a little bit and let John Gruden go out and win this one.
Yeah, so I know it's definitely a little bit of weak tea, but like I do think it's quite notable that Jerry Rice, one of the greatest football players of all time, also brought up the idea that Gruden did not like the Raiders, especially considering, you know, before coming to the Raiders, he was on the 49ers, where he went to and won 3 Super Bowls. He knows what a solid Super Bowl plan needs to be. He knows what needs to happen in the locker room. And he's skeptical that Bill Callahan doesn't like the Raiders. Then maybe there's a little more validity to this idea.
I mean, Callahan was also a first-year head coach.
Yeah,
like,
you're right.
Maybe he just wasn't 100% with himself after drawing up his original Super Bowl layout plan, and then last second decided to change it because he thought it was better, because he didn't know any better because it was only his first year.
Yeah, and he was playing under his former head coach, right? Like, I want to make it clear, I completely agree with you, J. Cole, but I'm just playing a little bit of devil's advocate here on behalf of Tim Brown and Jerry Rice. And our last player here, who is named John Ritchie, the Raiders fullback, whose last NFL game was actually the Super Bowl loss. He added his thoughts.
I've said it for years. What we practiced heavily during the week is not what we ran in that game. Could have been due to Barrett's absence. It was never explained to me. I believe I said it was on record every year we talked about the Super Bowl on ESPN. I always thought it would get sensational like this.
So what's really interesting about this quote, as pointed out by Dalton Blackman, is that it contradicts what Brown and Rice previously said about Callahan's plan change leading to Barrett's absence from the game. Did you catch that? He says that the loss could have been due to...
the plan was changed due to Barrett's absence.
Exactly. And this is the thing that makes me most skeptical about this entire theory. There seems to be this chicken and egg dynamic where players who believe that it was rigged can't agree whether Barrett's absence was due to the game plan change or the game plan change was due to Barrett's absence. And that detail alone, among a lot of the other stuff that we mentioned that I think is pretty unsavory about this theory, is enough to discredit it for me.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, you got to figure out your timeline if you're going to come out and say these things.
Exactly. If you can't agree on the basic facts of a conspiracy, it makes it that much less believable. It's like, it reminds me of the flat earth theory, where you have 40 million people who believe in this, but every single one of them has their own version of the flat earth. If you guys can't even come up with your own unified theory of what flat earth is, how do you expect me to believe it? Right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, if you're giving multiple different excuses, at that point it just becomes excuses.
I completely agree. And in this situation, I personally have come to the conclusion that I'm unconvinced. There simply does not seem to be a credible enough motive for a rigged game, nor enough evidence. I also think that this sort of conspiracy in the NFL only serves to play into the further proliferation of conspiracies in the league. It creates a sort of permission structure that leads down a rabbit hole where today people are genuinely claiming that the entirety of the NFL is scripted. Well, an interesting story, it worries me that this sort of theory and the involvement of NFL players in it only foretells worse versions of this occurring in the future.
I will say, though, that maybe NFL script writing was at play here to get this matchup, you know? Like, number one offense versus number one defense, head coach versus protege. Like, that's going to get some good viewing. Like, that's a script that the NFL would write out to be played, but I don't think, especially if the betting odds were only +4, were +4 for the Buccaneers, and they ended up winning, what was it, like 44 to 20 something? Like,
yeah, exactly. Like, I respect that if they were writing the script, this would be a good plot line. But overall, like, I just think that this general skepticism that games are rigged, that so many Super Bowls are rigged, that every year I feel like after the Super Bowl, the next day you go online and there's people claiming from the losing team, oh, like this call, it was all fixed against us because of X, Y, and Z.
The refs were against us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, a lot of that precedent came from this Super Bowl by these big-time players. Jerry Rice coming out and saying, I think this guy didn't like my team, so he didn't want us to win.
Yeah,
it just seems like this led us down to a really bad place and represents a lot of the reason why we have to make this podcast to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. Like, to disprove that what these NFL players say might not actually be what the truth is.
Exactly. And I think that's what's most important to remember from this episode. So much of the stuff that we cover is just fan theory and just conjecture, so it's easy to brush off. But what needs to be incredibly clear here is no matter how pilled on it your favorite NFL player is, they could definitely be lying.
All right, welcome to my section of the podcast where we talk about some wild, wacky, fun, controversial NFL.
Still workshopping it.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of just turned into like a funny story.
Yeah.
Interesting NFL. I don't know. Hey, make it whatever you want. I don't know. All right, so today I got two stories here. One of them is a little more worked than the other, so I'm going to give you the real story, and then I'll give you the story that we can have a fun conversation over.
All right, sounds good to me.
So the first one is, in 1968, NBC created a made-for-TV movie called Heidi, and it was contractually obligated to start at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, following the Jets vs. Raiders football game. However, the game was close and went late. NBC decided to air the conclusion of the football game. However, all their phone lines were jammed because football fans were asking if the game was going to be cut off, so they were unable to relay that decision to their control board. So at 7 p.m., the movie started and the ending of the game was completely cut off.
Wait, so the fans missed it because their own fault of calling into the station?
Yes.
That's awesome.
During the time that the game was cut off, the Raiders scored 2 touchdowns in the final minute of the game and won 43-32.
Wow.
As a result, the NFL inserted a clause into all of its TV contracts guaranteeing that all close games would be broadcast completely in their home market.
That's a wonderful story. That also begs the question of if the NFL has a legal definition of what a close game is. They must.
They have to, I guess,
Yeah.
if it's in a clause.
Yeah,
like
just,
it's in a
interesting thing I
contract.
thought, yeah.
Yeah, but...
That's a great
crazy.
story.
Yeah.
It's such like a
bunch of on-edge NFL fangirls calling into the
Literally,
station because they were scared that they were going to have to watch a made-for-TV movie after a commercial break.
It's so anachronistic. Like, this is so 90s. This would never happen today.
This is 1968.
This was 1968. Oh my god. This is, yeah, this is a mint story. This is a good one.
All right, and the second one is a little sketchier, but here's what I got for you. There's an old rumor that when the Super Bowl first started airing on TV, that NBC had their coverage drop out during the game. So they had an intern pretend to be hammered drunk and run out on the field to buy time so that they could get their feed back up and running.
Okay, this is a rumor though, right?
First Super Bowl was broadcast by two networks. NBC had the telecast rights to AFL games and CBS to NFL games. So they both separately broadcast the game with their own announcers. So as the legend goes, when one of the networks lost their field, they were afraid viewers would switch to the other network. That's why they had their intern run out on the field. No clue if it's true or just a legend.
Oh my god. I pray this one's true.
Imagine how wild that is, though. Like, you're like an NBC intern. You're sitting at a Super Bowl watching the game, and you just get a message. A telegram comes in for you.
Telegram.
And it's from like the NBC head boss, and it's like, run onto the field right now. We will cover all charges.
Like, yeah, I would never though. Are you kidding me? There's no way I would do that for my boss.
Well, no, I mean, not today's age, but back then, that just seems like a normal thing you would do.
You think so? That's just a normal ask in the 60s?
Yeah, in the 60s, if your boss said just run out onto the field, I would run out.
How much time does that really stop? Like,
I don't know. It's unconfirmed. This is just a legend.
and you know what? People run out on the field for way less. So
Yeah,
who am I
exactly.
to say? Who am I to say?
So yeah, that's a couple of NFL broadcasting stories that I found that were kind of funny.
Yeah, those are some good ones. Thank you for listening to this week's episode.
You can find us on Twitter at FB Conspiracies, where we will post all the graphics and links we spoke about during this episode.
You can also reach us by email using fbconspiracies@gmail.com.
A special thanks to Blaze for the music.
If you enjoyed, consider leaving a review.
Join us next week for more football conspiracies.
For today's episode, okay.